Hello, this is David from Cognitive Counseling. Today I want to talk about something that happened this recently with a client who said to me that they had a lot of feelings about what happened with George Floyd, the protests and the riots, but they were afraid to talk to me about it. And when I asked them why, they said it was because of the color of my skin. And they explained that they were afraid that I would have a different point of view, and that different point of view would make them look differently at me because of that. And I could definitely understand the trepidation of having a fear about that. But it also tells you that the belief is that somehow, because we have different colors of skin, that necessitates a different belief system. Even though, more often than not, what I find is that as you have conversations with people, more people generally agree on more things when they're open to facts and actually finding out about information. And it doesn't matter which way you go. I've met people who are very conservative when they get certain facts that they pull and say, oh, wait a minute, I did not realize that, and learn. And there are people that are more liberal that get certain facts and they go, wow, I didn't realize that, and learn. And it's got nothing to do with affiliation. It has to do with the idea of finding out reality. Now, I'm going to come across a bunch of things tonight that hopefully will give a little bit more context, but also to help get rid of some of the waters of misunderstanding. The biggest issue here is a lot of people don't understand even what the idea when people talk about white privilege, what it even means. And they have a lot of misconceptions about it. And for a lot of white people, because of the color of their skin and where they grew up, they're like, what privilege are you talking about? I struggled. My family struggled. We went through hell. I don't know what you're talking about in terms of this. And a lot of people of color saying that's because you don't understand it because of your white skin. So hopefully I can give a little bit of context to that and a little bit more understanding of it so that we can get to a better definition of it. And again, if you disagree or you think that you have something to add, I'd love for you to speak about it and say it in the comments below. First, I'm going to show you a video that tries to illustrate the idea about race.
Line up! Line up! Everybody line up! We're about to race! Everybody line up! Shoulder to shoulder! Take off your backpacks! Basketball, line up! We're about to race! Hey, we are racing for a $100 bill. The winner of this race will take this. It's a $100 bill. Before I say go, I'm going to make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward.
So you see that this race is being set up as a metaphor for life. That certain people are going to have privilege because they're going to answer some of the questions yes, and every time they get to answer yes, they get to move forward.
If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home.
Now, the first 2 questions are about family dynamics. Whether or not you are married, and if you're married, you're more likely that the father is going to be in the home. Notice he said father figure, but it could be your father or another man who's a father figure. That's got nothing to do with race. This has everything to do with behavior. Now, in the 1930s, African Americans had a higher wedlock rate than whites. Today, 70% of African American kids are born out of wedlock. Now, that has far-reaching reasons why that took place, and a lot more to do with the way that the government has handled the systems that have created a lot of that issue. But again, that has nothing to do inherently with somebody's race. You could be white and not have a family member in your family home, or you could have divorce in a family if you're white, and it has nothing to do with a racial question. So the first 2 questions have nothing to do with race, But yet, you'll start to see that they're bringing racial disparity due to the fact of race.
Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up.
Now the next 2 questions, whether or not you had access to a private education or you had access to free tutors, have more to do with socioeconomic status than anything else. The more money you have, the more privilege you're going to have in general, and the more things that you're going to get. Being in a private school that has a high rate of tuition generally has free tutors, which again has nothing to do with race. Michael Jordan's children, LeBron James' children, are going to private schools that are going to have private tutors. That has nothing to do with their race. There are many poor white families that have to be stuck in a public school and don't have free tutors.
Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability, you don't have to pay for college. Take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from. I want you guys up.
Now, all those questions, all again, have to do with how much money you make. So, basically, depending on if you came from a family that had more substantial wealth and your parents stayed together, you were at the front of the line. If your parents did not stay together and you did not come from wealth, you are at the back of the line. That's what this shown so far. And this has nothing to do with race.
Here in the front, just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made.
Now, again, he's saying this has nothing to do with what you have done, which is 100% correct. If you have parents that were bigger people and taller, you will generally be taller through no fault of your own. If you have parents that were black, you are more likely to be black through no fault of your own. If your parents were white, you are more likely to be white through no fault of your own. If you are born into a situation where you have wealth and they're together, psychologically you have a leg up. We know the effects of divorce on children and the way that affects them. That's why it's important to be able to stay together if possible. Now, of course, you can't stay together always, but if possible, it's better for children to grow up within a 2-parent family. Research has shown that over and over again. But none of this has anything to do with race. This all has to do with socioeconomic status.
Everything I have said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been given more opportunity. We don't want to recognize that we've been given a head start. But the reality is we have. Now, there's no excuse. They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be extremely foolish of you not to utilize that and learn more about somebody else's story. Because the reality is, if this was a fair race and everybody was back on that line, I guarantee you some of these black dudes would smoke all of you. And it's only because you have this big of a head start that you're possibly going to win this race called life.
Now, this is where it turns, where he's now defining white privilege as being the aspect of having more money and coming from a 2-parent family. And this is why many white people hear this and say, I don't believe in white privilege. Because white privilege has to do with The manner by which I was born and my family has nothing to do with me. But my white family did not have that. I grew up in a divorced home. I grew up with no money. I'd be at the back of that line with his supposed aspects of saying all the black people that are behind there. In actuality, that's a racist comment too, because 30% of the African American population would be up in front of that line with all the white kids, just by the numbers of who's in the middle class and married. But that isn't the issue of systemic racism or white privilege. It's got nothing to do with this definition. But when you create a false definition and people hear and see this, they know something is inherently wrong. That doesn't tell you anything. Because if your children decide to get divorced and not do certain behaviors, you're going to, in a sense, lose your white privilege. But that's not how it works. White privilege is inherent. It's not something you choose to do. When you use white privilege, you don't say, man, I'm going to use my white privilege now. You don't even know it's being done. When you have an African American that goes to the police station and states a crime that took place against him, and he is not taken as seriously as a white person, or when he makes a complaint, his complaint is not taken the same way as a white person, that will be an issue of that white privilege.
That is a picture of life, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing you've done has put you in the lead that you're in right now. When I say go, on your mark, get set, go! If you didn't learn anything from this activity, you're a fool.
And of course, the aspect of blaming the person for not learning from the activity, they're foolish. Well, that is true. You'd be foolish not to learn that if you come from a richer background that's more stable, you're going to get a leg up in life. That is absolutely true. That's not systemic racism. That's not white privilege. So the nature by which it's trying to prove something by talking about it to race is incorrect. And this is why so many people don't recognize what white privilege is based upon a false definition. Because white privilege has nothing to do with economic status. If a poor white person walks into a store, or a rich black person walks into the store, if the black person is looked at differently just because of the color of his skin, that's the issue. If a police officer is pulling over more African Americans who may be doctors and lawyers and just normal law-abiding citizens, but because their skin color is darker, that they're more likely to be pulled over, that would be systematic. And I mean, the idea of white privilege, that you're not being pulled over and they are, and a form of systematic racism. If a police officer is more likely to pull the trigger on a gun because they perceive that an African American is more dangerous, that would be a form of that. And you see, it's more subtle. It's not the glaring aspect of seeing that people are rich and therefore their families are together. That's white privilege. That's ridiculous. White privilege has nothing to do with that, which is the reason why so many people say, I have no idea what they're talking about. I did not grow up that way. I had family that had a struggle. I struggled for everything that I had, and you want to say it was because of my white skin? And that's why they lose that kind of argument to people, and they don't understand that. But if you said to somebody, no, that's not the issue. It's got nothing to do with the choices that your parents made. But what it does have to do with is how people will treat you when you walk into a store, or how they look at you a certain way, as opposed to an us versus them. Just to give you one more example, in the Amy Cooper situation, I believe that a lot of the right the people that have come to defend her mindset and the idea that she was mentally ill, or the fact was that you have to look at both sides, come from an aspect of systemic racism or the denial of systemic racism in order to prove that it doesn't exist. They come up with very bizarre ways of trying to see something very clear because it doesn't fit with the worldview. So the nature of that mindset gets skewed to prove that the white systemic racism doesn't exist. So we have to go ahead and label her something to get rid of this mindset. But something as clear as day as that, you get to see racism and the way that people see them or see people outside of themselves. And there's all different types. And it is true that people can go in different directions with racism. It's not one way. And it gives people the false idea, and why people look at it and go, what are you talking about? That's not privilege. That has to do with choices my parents did, my sacrifice they made, or the sacrifices I made to give a better life to my kids. They can do that too. And they're right. Anybody who says that somebody who's African American can stay married and be able to grow economically is absolutely correct. In fact, there's some really great people on YouTube right now who are African American making that same exact argument to African Americans about the idea of the choices they decide to spend. I can't remember the guy's name right now who talks about the idea of looking rich or being able to fake looking rich as opposed to being rich. And he goes on explaining about these concepts and talks about it from the financial standpoint, which is absolutely wonderful and great. That's got nothing to do with skin color. I know there was a financial advisors that were being taught in the MBA because so many sports athletes who made millions of dollars were end up broke 5 years, I think it was, after retirement, because they didn't understand what and how money works, that eventually that big chunks of money stop coming in, and then you can't sustain it anymore based upon the lifestyle that you've created. And then they end up claiming bankruptcy. This happens to many athletes, actually, in many different, but the NBA took note of it and started to help their players by teaching financial education to their players. But again, that's got nothing to do with skin color. That has to do with knowledge. And sadly, finance is not taught in schools anywhere. It's one of the few things that I don't understand why it's not taught in every class, in every place in the entire United States. Finance is something you need much more than trigonometry. I know that it's very difficult to understand this, but coming across a right triangle and understanding Pythagoras' theorem of a squared plus b squared equals c squared might be very, very important. But understanding about financial education, compound interest, and understand what it means to pay back loans and how much you're paying back and what interest rates are is much more important to everybody's life, but is not taught. So the idea of helping people through education is very important, but it's got nothing to do with race. So when people talk about privilege, that is the wrong definition. And anytime you hear people talking about it that way, about, well, white people have more money and therefore then it's the reason why they have privilege, is not true. Because there are plenty of poor white people that don't have that, and they say, I don't understand this. This has got nothing to do with race. But what does have to do with white privilege has to do with when you walk into a police department and you make a complaint and you talk about how your rights were violated by somebody. How likely are you to be believed? How likely are you to be heard? How likely are you to be dismissed? Have the police officer who is dealing with you, how they treat you. Are they treating you with respect or disrespect? Now, these things are much more subtle. And if you have your own internal bias already and you interact with a police officer, you are somewhat more likely to create the very thing that you think is the other person going to be doing. In other words, if I feel that you are a liar and I treat you like you're a liar, you are more likely to become more aggressive with me than if I think that you are a truth teller and then I'm going to be treating you on the same level. The other aspect is that there is the projection of the person, of the police officer towards you. They see you and they have a certain projection. So I'm going to show you two two maps, just to give you an idea of what I mean by this. The first map is the chart of black Americans are 2.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police. This is the percent disparity between each state, African American population to percentages. Blacks killed by police in 2019. So if you notice over here in this part of the country, you have the yellow part, which is mostly are less than 10% more likely. Then you have the orange parts, where it's 10 to 19, the red parts 20 to 29, and then 30% or more on these darker parts. Now, you'll notice it's more towards the East Coast, except in this little middle over here, but generally you see that it's concentrated. Now I want to show you another map. Studying up. Officer shot to death in the line of duty in 2019. Now, I'm going to ask you, do you see any pattern here? Besides the West Coast, where there's a few over here, especially specifically in this area, and I'm wondering if you took California, if you looked at that area, if you would see more. But if you look over here to this map, with the predominant aspects, and this is only in this aspect of the line of duty, and assuming that this would be the same, maybe, and again, I don't know if this is true, this chart may have something to do with this chart, where police officers may get a certain feeling based upon who's being shot by whom. And in taking a look at these two, they have found that more likely a police officer to be shot by somebody of color than somebody who's not. And maybe that plays a role in this. But again, without the statistics, you get into a lot of these issues. Study that claims white police no more likely to shoot minority draws fire. And again, in this one, which talks about the red flags of a recent study, because it talks about the idea of this bias of the study of that white police officers were no more likely than non-white colleagues to shoot minorities. Now, other researchers are debating that. Now, let me explain to you what they're debating. What they're debating is, how do you look at the data and how do you interpret it? And it's not so clear-cut. And you can go back and forth with numbers. This is one of the aspects that you'll hear of Candace Owen, who shoots off numbers beautifully, which are true. And then you have somebody else who shoots off numbers, and they're true. And they're both telling you the truth, but they're looking at it from two different points of view. And that's why it is very important to get numbers. I'm going to talk about this in a second with this video, which I thought was really good to explain this concept.
ProPublica study pointed out that it found that among young black men aged ages 15 to 19, they were shot by police at a rate 21 times higher than whites the same age. You can see the numbers up there on the screen: 1.47 per million among whites, 31.17 per million among black.
Now, this is an interesting statistic, and I love when CNN chooses the statistics because, of course, we're looking at ages 15 to 19. Why are you looking at only 4 years? And is it more likely for people of 15 to 19 to be in gang involvement, in which neighborhood and who often, and which gangs are bigger, and how many more are there? Because 15 to 19 is a very young age, right? These are kids. And the question is, how many were involved in criminal behavior at those ages? So this is a very interesting stat that is being brought up.
That's a problem, right?
It is. Well, and if you look at it, what ProPublica means, that is per capita or by percentage. So if you look at the percentage of blacks and look at the percentage of whites, then you get that. It's not done by population. And so, yeah, it is a problem when you look at one is 1.47 per million and the other one is 31.17 per million. And again, you have to remember, African Americans only make up 12% of the population. Some of that, quite honestly, is probably attributed to the fact that maybe there is more interaction with law enforcement, but still.
Don Lemon does something very beautiful here, and you heard him. He does it himself. He says that may have to do with the fact that maybe more African American teenagers are coming into police contact than whites at that age. And that's the problem. Yes, that might be true. But again, without knowing the numbers, you don't know which is true. How many? But I love how he puts it in and then just goes right over it. Let's not look at that. But that is key. Because if 2,000 African American kids are having issues with law enforcement, and only 10 kids that are white are having problems at age with law enforcement, and again, those numbers are absolutely made up, then of course you're going to see a much higher number if there's any police brutality across one group as opposed to another. So it's not a minor point about what that number is, and that's a problem here.
Oh, those numbers are jarring when you look at it. 31 times or 21 times more, 24 times more. That's a huge number.
Last night, Don, Bill O'Reilly, he had some other statistics suggesting police shootings aren't necessarily unreasonably high in the black community. He said when you include all age groups, more than twice as many whites were killed by police in 2012 by blacks. He said 123 blacks were killed in 2012 by police, 326 whites.
Now, it's interesting because I love this, and CNN is quoting a Bill O'Reilly statistic, which I think is great because I think it's like, okay, let's talk about the other side, and I think we need to see a lot more of this in news in general. Because what happens is that when you get two sides of an issue, and especially when you're dealing with facts, you want to hear what would be another point of view or another way of seeing things. You want to be able to see what is true. Now, the O'Reilly statistic he's talking about is the total number of deaths, which you see here is basically almost 2.5 to 3 times greater. So and that's in all age groups. So again, you took the specific age group between 15 and 19, and then what O'Reilly's answer was is this. So I want you to hear the answer here because this is very important.
Were killed. You see the numbers right there. Is that a fair statistic?
Well, he's right and he's wrong. So here's the thing. The reason I'm looking down because I think this is very important. I want to get the numbers correct. The first one that we looked at, these were 15 to 19-year-olds, and that was over a 2-year period from 2010 to 2012. So 21 times greater than whites. And then the stat that you just showed from Bill O'Reilly, this is in 2012. 123 blacks in 2012, and 326 were killed by cops, I should say. And then 123 whites were killed by cops.
No, 123 blacks,
123 blacks and 326 whites were killed by cops. But he's not doing it percentage-wise. If you look at it again, 12% of the population, he's not doing it by percentages, he's doing it by total population.
Now, Don Lemon does right now what he earlier said in the video backwards. And he's saying, wait a minute, Bill, the issue is then you have to take a look at it by population. But you don't. You have to take a look at by how many police contacts. And he made mention of this actually earlier in the same exact video. He said that when you take a look at that, one of the answers may be, well, that African American kids are coming into contact more with police, therefore that's happening. And then he skirted over that. And then when O'Reilly gave the statistic, he says, well, you can't look at it that way because, the population is the issue of how many white people there are in the population to black people in the population. But that's not how you look at it. You look at it as how many people came into contact with police over that. And really to measure that is a lot more difficult. I'm not saying there isn't racism. We know racism exists. That's a fact. The question is, how much is there? What is the nature of police brutality and what is the nature of racism? And we know there's a certain amount of racism and we know there's a certain amount of police brutality, but we don't know what the numbers are. And people just like to make assumptions based upon the event. Was George Floyd killed just because of police brutality? Or was George Floyd killed because of racism? Right now, nobody really knows that for sure except his murderer. That person knows why he did what he did. And maybe that will come out in trial. And I don't know if it will or won't, because I don't believe that you'll always get the truth from a defense. You're going to get what's going to try to get their client off as much as possible. But the nature by which this is going on, you start to see how these numbers could be flipped and switched and looked at in different ways.
Even yet with those numbers, and you think it's only 12% of the population, that's still a large number. That's still a bigger percentage.
Yes, Sonny, go ahead.
And can I weigh in? I mean, I think when you really look at the statistics statistics rather are really faulty, because when you talk about officer-involved shootings, Wolf, there isn't a mandatory reporting, right? It's self-reporting. It's almost on the honor system. And so although the FBI does have some statistics, most people know that those statistics can't even be counted upon because they are self-reported. And so my suggestion has been all along that we need mandatory reporting from our law enforcement agencies around the country. And
Sonny Houston here makes an unbelievably good point that still till today we don't have. And that is, we do need mandatory statistics. We do need to see what's real. We do need to see what happens and what's going on. It can't be just left to what the media tells us and the idea of these things, because anybody can sit and play these games, which is why you have intelligent people both on different sides that disagree with each other, and they see things in different ways because of it. There is no question there is systematic racism that goes on. Now, when I say systematic racism, I don't believe, as some people try to say, well, white people don't get up in the morning and say, let's go kill a black person. I would agree with that. That is not what I think systematic racism is. That's another misdefinition. That's creating what's called the straw man argument, where you create the argument of a straw, you knock it down and say, you see, that's not what I mean. The same way that systematic racism is not being born to somebody with parents that live together and have money. Because there are a lot of black people, specifically in the middle class, that have two-parent families and have money. And a lot of sports athletes that have lots of money that are in two-parent families. Those children are going to get a leg up over white people that are living in a single-parent home with a addicted parent who's the primary person that's there and having to struggle to make it through life. And then go tell that person, you suffer from white privilege. You tell that to that person. They're going to look at you like you fell off a tree, with not understanding what it means to be white privilege. It's much more subtle. It's the idea of when you walk into a store, how does the people there see you based upon the color of your skin, not knowing anything about your economics.
And I think that the number of officer shootings involving young black males is actually much higher than is even self-reported. And so that's something that really needs to be part of the conversation.
ProPublica study.
What I love about that at the ending there is that she believes it's higher. And she might be right, but she also might be wrong, and we don't know. And that's the problem. That's the problem when you have a situation where you don't know the facts, when you don't know what's right. So I really, really believe that it's important that we have the ability to have the conversation, the ability to talk to one another. It should never be, I'm afraid of what your opinion is, I need to back away and not talk to you about it. I think the one thing that can come out of this that's a beautiful thing is the ability for all of us to be able to have a conversation, to talk about things, to see things from another point of view. And again, not to give misdefinitions. You say to a white person, you have white privilege because you have money and you grew up with two-parent family, they're going to look at you, no. You say you have white privilege because when a police officer pulls you over or stops you, he is more likely either to believe you or more likely to not have pulled you over in the first place. Now, how are you going to say that? When they saw stop and frisk that took place, they saw that minorities were being looked at much more often. But minorities had a higher level of crime rates. So was that the reason because of systematic racism? Or they were looking where they thought crime was? Again, it gets very muddied. It's not so clear cut. And this is the reason why it's so important to have these conversations. There needs to be more cultural sensitivity taught to officers in general so that they understand what it means to walk in the other person's shoes. And in the study that I explained to you about, the more whites being shot, they actually explain in the study that, here it is, from 1980 to 2013, there were 2,269 officers killed in felony incidents, 2,896 offenders. The racial breakdown of the offenders of the 30-year period were on par. For the 10-year period, 52% of the offenders were white and 41% were black. Now, if police officers have a tendency to believe that they're more in danger from one community over another, because, as Don Lemon said, African Americans make up 13% of the population, but it's really not 13%, it's 6%, because you're really looking at more African American males. You don't see African American females being shot at the same rate, not even close. And that's the reason why you don't hear about that in the news, because that goes down again to race. So it's not African Americans are being shot at much higher rates, it's African American men. And that's a very important distinction, because when you're talking about race, and it was just about race, why aren't women then equally being shot? Why is it only African American men, or mostly African American men? So if the offenders are African American men, then again, does that play into the psychological rates? Because when they look at Latinos and African American police officers, they also shoot them at a higher rate. So the question is again, why? And again, this is where the water gets very muddy about how you view these things and see these things. And again, going back to the Philip Zimbardo experiment in college, when you have anybody in charge and they have power, there's going to be an element of abuse of that power. But I want to show you one thing that I thought was absolutely very beautiful. And even though you'll hear disparaging comments and stuff, but I want you to hear the way that people heard this, and let's talk a little bit about this.
Don't even give them the spotlight. Everybody get back over here. They don't exist. Don't give them the spotlight. Walk away.
Go back.
This is America. If they don't like that, that's their problem.
Let them come on up. Let them come on stage with the black man. I'm gonna let Black Lives Matter come up here while I show them what patriotism is about. It's about freedom of speech. It's about celebration. So what we are going to do is something you're not used to, and we're going to give you 2 minutes of our platform to put your message out. Now, whether they disagree or agree with your message is irrelevant. It's the fact that you have the right to have the message.
I am an American. And the beauty of America is that when you see something broke in your country, you can mobilize to fix it. So you ask why there's a Black Lives Matter? Because you can watch a black man die and be choked to death on television and nothing happened. We need to address that. You need to fix it. We are not anti-cop. We are anti-bad cop. We say if a cop is bad, he needs to get fired like a bad plumber, like a bad lawyer, like a bad fucking politician.
Now you understand what happened there, and I think it's a very important thing. He was stating, we're not anti-police. We're anti-bad police. Now, the people in the crowd who don't want to hear the message, the first thing, yes you are, yes you are. And the reason why they have to do that is because I then don't have to listen to you. If I can say that you're evil and I can put you down, it makes it much harder. But when he gives the full message, listen to the cheers of the crowd.
We don't want handouts. We don't want anything that's yours. We want our God-given right to freedom, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I want to leave you with this, and I'm gone. You're right, my brother. You're right. You are so right.
Now, this is where the big problem comes about. And I love the fact that he answers, you're right, that all lives matter. But the perception, and again, to the level of reality, it's difficult to know without facts. To the level of reality, the Black Lives Matter group here is explaining that there's an injustice going on just due to the color of the skin. They've experienced it. They've felt it. They felt it when they're dealing with police officers who dealt with them in disrespectful ways that they might not have seen when they saw a white person being dealt with that way. And then it trickles down, because when you see one group differently, even in an unfair way, you become a victim to that. And that's why they're speaking up to them and saying that Black Lives Matter. They're not saying that they don't believe that anybody else's life doesn't matter. They're saying your life is not in danger in the same way. That's why they're saying Black Lives Matter. You are not in the same danger by police in the same way that we are. Now, is that true or not? Is actually hard to actually see the level. When you hear about, well, there's this amount or that amount, I remember Charlemagne the God was said that there was only few numbers, and he goes, well, in 9/11 there was only one incident where the terrorist attack, and that was enough to go off. And yes, we knew what the motivation was. We knew what they were trying to do, and it was a very valid point. But what the motivation is when these incidents happen is much less clear. It doesn't mean that there isn't racial components. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at it. We should, but we need so much more data.
All lives matter, right? But when a black life is lost, we get no justice. That's why we say Black Lives Matter.
And that's the truth. The aspect is what most people are upset about here. And in all these situations is why they say no justice, no peace. Why they say they want justice. And what ends up happening, sadly, is that a lot of times that politics takes up the cause and people get pushed to do certain things that don't work well in the justice system. And one of the things I fear is when you start upping the charge and saying, yeah, they upped the charge, you've now created a situation where you possibly are going to help that person to get off because you've just created the burden of proof you have to give much greater. We all know what the murder that took place. But was it murder 2, murder 1, or manslaughter? That gets very difficult. And you're going to hear people disagree on that. You're going to hear lawyers explain why this is the case, and another lawyer saying, well, not so fast. And that's where things get very bad. And depending on how good the lawyers are, they're going to be able to make certain cases specific things, and the next thing you know, somebody gets acquitted. And then you're going to lose it totally, saying, you see, no justice. Not recognizing that the burden of proof you created because of political pressure is going to undermine the very thing that you want to see, which is a conviction.
That's why we say Black Lives Matter.
I really cannot stand when people say that black people don't care about black on black crime. They do. The only thing is that they don't think it's racially motivated. The idea that somebody wants to kill you with their motivation makes a huge difference. Think about this. People can make fun of their own parent and say about what their own parent is. But try making fun of their parent the way they did and see their reaction. It is true that black on black crime is absolutely horrific. And believe me, enough of the people I work with talk about it. But they don't believe that crime has any racial motivation. A lot of times the color, ironically, is either blue or red of that motivation for a lot of it. But the nature of the crime is not racial in its intent. And therefore, there's less of that issue. What they're angry about is the fact that it's systemic racism that they've been fighting with and hearing about their entire lives. Remember, African Americans weren't brought here because they wanted to come here freely. They were brought here against their will. And worse, they had more rights in the early part of the 19th century than they did by the 1950s and 60s. And there were laws that were pushed against them for a long period of time, systematically. And it is a good thing that we're moving past that in terms of the laws. But there's a lot of anger that has been built up with the mistreatment and the rules that were made against them. Which is the reason why it is so important to understand when they're upset and angry and they're telling you what they're feeling, to give them the voice. And what I love about this is the fact that they were given the voice to get on that stage, to give their message, to be heard. And despite that there's disagreements, and that those disagreements are absolutely legitimate, it's good.
We want to make America great. We do it together.
All right. USA! 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 USA!
It kind of restored my faith in some of those people, because when I spoke truths, they agreed. I feel like we made progress. I feel like two sides that never listened to each other actually made progress today.
And that's exactly the point. We have the ability to be able to speak truth and be able to listen to each other and come to the same conclusion. And it doesn't make a difference what your background is, but it's important that we speak truth.
I expect to go on that stage? No. I expected to come down here, stand here with my fist in the air in a very militant way, and to exchange insults, maybe some dirty looks, or who knows what. If not on a grander level, but just person to person, you know. I think we really made some substantial steps without either side yielding it. Yeah. I hope that they understand that one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement is a proud American and a Christian who cares deeply about this country, who cares deeply about the people in it, whether they are documented or not. I want them to understand that we are educated, right? That we apply a strategy, but we come from a place of love, right? And we really are here to help this country move toward a better place, not to destroy it. A man who controls a 4,000 member militia shook my hand and said, I always knew I identified with you, but today solidified it. Wow. One of the heads of Bikers for Trump came up and shook my hand, asked me to take a picture with his son. A little blonde head kid named Jacob. Like, that's special. Like, here I went from being their enemy to someone they want to take pictures with their children, and that's the power of communication. We came out, we were going to chant, we were going to do a demonstration, but we didn't have to. We just spoke, and it worked. I'm happy about that.
We need a lot more of that in this country and this society. We need to hear each other a lot more. We need to stop yelling at each other, stop telling each other what the story is, to hear our different points of view, to be able to talk to each other, be black, white, Hispanic, male, female, transgender. It doesn't matter. We all have our experiences and our points of view. It should never be, I can't talk to you because you're a different skin color, or a different race, or a different religion, or a different gender. We should be able to have that. And together, when we do that, we'll find that we have a lot more in common than we actually have as differences. I hope that you like this video. I hope that you'll share it. I hope that people understand this message and how important it is, especially at this time. And I hope and pray that things move in a positive direction. And the fact is that a man like George Floyd, who had his difficulties and problems, can lead to a healing and an ability for people to see the problems in our society and that we need to fix them. Again, thank you very much. I hope you have a good night, a good mental health.